Okay, we're going to start now. I'm Andy Rose. Here's the most value I'm going to add. Please switch your mobile phones to silent right now, because it's really embarrassing if they go off in the middle of the talk. So, I'm here to introduce Matteo Maggiori. Now, for those of you who haven't encountered Matteo's CV, I strongly encourage you to read it somewhere private so that nobody can see your expression when you read it. And part of the reason is it's very clear by the second word, which is Maggiori, his name. Maggiori turns out to be an Italian adjective that means greater, and his is greater. Matteo is a chaired professor of finance at Stanford GSB. He's a Carlo Alberto medalist, which means he's been named the best Italian economist under the age of 40. A Bernasser Prize laureate, which means he's the best European economist under the age of 40. A Fisher-Black Prize winner, meaning he's the best financial economist under the age of 40. He's a Guggenheim Fellow, a Carnegie Fellow, an NBER Research Fellow in a bunch of different programs, a CPR Research Fellow in another group. He's been on the RE Stud Tour. He's won a big bunch of prizes, given many keynotes, organized conferences, held positions at Harvard and Princeton. He's a star teacher, as you will find out very shortly. He's already produced 20 PhD students. He has papers in the very top journals, including AER, QJE, JPE, Econometrica, JFE, RFS, PNAS, and he's generated enough citations that I'm sure there's somebody in the room that's trying to reverse engineer his production function right now. I consider this litany of achievements to be stunning and even exhausting, and you might even say depressing to a mere mortal like me. But I was asked to introduce him not as a CV, but as a person. And I have one big advantage here. I was on his thesis committee. Now, at the time, I might have told myself that I was trying to provide guidance, but really it's clear to me now that my only substantial contribution was not getting in the way. And that's what I think of my value added. What I remember really vividly about Matteo as a student was not only his intelligence, though that was obvious immediately, but the alarming level of polish. Most graduate students arrive with either technical skills or broad ideas or social functioning, but Matteo inconveniently has all three. Now, for those of you who haven't been through many of these, when you're practicing delivering your job market paper, many students treat it sort of like a hostage negotiation, right? So like, they say something like, I know equation 47 looks strange, but if you just give me another hour implicitly, I'll figure it out. But Matteo presents research, as you will see, sort of the way that an elite athlete warms up. Now, he sort of casually does things that would be career-defining events for mere mortals like me. Okay. Now, that creates challenges for senior faculty. Academia depends psychologically on the belief that wisdom arrives with age. But then the problem is somebody like Matteo appears and forces people like me to confront an alternative theory, which is maybe some people are just operating at a different frequency from the start. So that's when people like me start emphasizing experience. Now, despite all of this, Matteo remains unusually collegial and generous, which frankly to me seems really unfair. Academic life is far more emotionally manageable when brilliance comes packaged with at least one compensating flaw, like arrogance or chaos or an inability to answer email or body odor or a tendency to discuss SDF distributions over cocktails wildly inappropriately. But Matteo persists in being thoughtful, collaborative, and broadly liked, which means that he denies his peers the comfort of resentment and forces them into the really difficult position of being genuinely admirable. So one of the things that I do find remarkable about Matteo's work is it's simultaneously deeply theoretical and empirically serious. That's a rare combination, and most of us drift to one side of that border and sort of wave at the other. But Matteo has built a project, and he's a founder of the Global Capital Allocation Project, precisely to bridge that gap. It's part of his work as a founder of modern geoeconomics, which you're going to hear about very soon, the use of economic tools to achieve political goals. Now, one of the implicit ambitions that I've noticed for a long time is, in some sense, to map where all the wealth in the world actually is, which, depending on your priors, is either a really interesting problem for financial economics or, as my son told me this morning, the beginning of a monologue by a James Bond villain. So today, you're in exceptional hands. You're going to hear about the emerging field of geoeconomics, and it's going to be rigorous but not sterile. Matteo is extremely ambitious but not grandiose at all. It's going to be sophisticated, but he's not going to require you in the audience to provide him with immediate emotional support. So that's a good thing. It's good for science, but it's pretty tough on those who've built our careers on being completely vague and when we give keynotes. Please join me in welcoming Matteo Maggiori.
Thank you, Andy. That's too nice. Okay, well, after that, I'm going to be a huge disappointment, very clearly. At some point, reality has to sink in, and that's going to be like largely what I have to do for the next 90 minutes, is disabuse you of half of the notions that Andy put forward. The only thing he said that was correct is he was my advisor. And when I first arrived at Berkeley, many of the people in internationals, so him, Murray, Opsful, Pierre-Olivier Gourinchas, Barry Eichengreen, I had known them for a lifetime as textbooks or famous papers. And as a student, you kind of walk on eggshells the first time you meet them. And well, the first time I tried to meet Murray, he just forgot he was meeting me, so that was easy. It took at least 2 or 3 attempts. But with Andy, the first time I met him, I walked into his office, and I'm Italian, I came from a tradition of professors are a big deal. You call them professor, they're very formal. So I showed up in his office and I tried to be very, very formal. And I wasn't 2 minutes in when he said, okay, can you please stop? Stop and just tell me some content. And that was kind of a big change for me. And since then, he hasn't told you all the many times that I show up with wrong stuff that was rather dubious, and that they just gently pushed me up the hill until I could see the end of the PhD. And it still happens. In fact, they normally give great speeches about me, but if I know Andy, somewhere half the way through my talk, I'm going to start getting emails saying, what you just said is not possibly right, and here's 10 better ways to do it, which is exactly what you want from advisors. Steve Davis and I ran a conference at Hoover recently, and Murray was in the audience. I wasn't even half through the slides before I started getting criticism via email, which was fantastic, because that's exactly what you want. So that's what I have to do for today. Would you mind putting my slides up? So I've been told that I have 90 minutes, and then we have 30 minutes of Q&A. Let's just agree on some ground rules. There are perfectly fine YouTube videos online already of me giving this talk. So for me to speak 90 minutes uninterrupted sounds entirely boring. What I suggest is that you ask questions throughout. If you have long philosophical questions, we probably want to do them at the end, especially because that way we can do it together with Andy and give you better answers. But if you have questions on the materials and clarifying questions, please jump in. Since we're recording, I've been told that you have to raise your hand and somebody will bring you a microphone. If it's really an impelling question because you think what I just said is outrageous, just shout it and I'll repeat it for the record, and we go from there, okay? So, okay, it's a great pleasure to be here. It's my first time at this event. I heard so much about it, and it's also my first time in Singapore. So I'm truly delighted all around for the invitation. But let's get in. Oh, let's see, this is not working. Okay, now it's working. Okay, so first, what is geoeconomics? So 4 years ago, during COVID, with my co-authors, we were a little bored of our own research. We were kind of hitting the typical diminishing returns, and we thought, let's do something different. And we sort of searched around for ideas, and we stumbled on this concept of geoeconomics, which at the time we thought was rather mysterious and probably a very long-term research agenda that nobody was going to care about. Of course, today it's a very common term, and I wake up every morning to news of what is the latest change in the world that is related to this. But to most economists, this isn't so familiar. And so I'm going to start with at least my definition. I think of it as large countries like the US or China exerting power abroad on foreign entities that might be government or corporates using the existing trade and finance relationships of their economies. There are many examples that are very obvious to you by now. China on rare earths, the US on semiconductors, the sanctions on Russia using the payment system, using SWIFT, which is a messaging system. These have become incredibly familiar. But particularly if you're a student, you might think that this is very new. Instead, it's not. It's more that the life that we've had for the last 20 years, it's the exception rather than the norm. Surprisingly, though, in terms of economic thinking, this is relatively new. So today I'm going to give you at least my rendition on these topics, and hopefully we can do a lot better. So when we started, there were just so many questions. First, is this even a thing? I mean, countries and governments like to feel powerful for all sorts of reasons. That doesn't mean it exists. If it is, where does it come from and how do you use it? Then, of course, if you're an economist, the first thing that comes to mind is welfare. Is this a positive sum game, a negative sum game, a zero-sum game? Just thinking about these questions. And then, of course, there is the word strategic. The word strategic sector in the national interest is probably one of the most abused words in the English language, mainly because if you want to get a subsidy from the government, the first thing you'll do is you'll claim that whatever you're doing is strategic in the national interest. Part of the reason why it's so easy to abuse is the lack of rigor, is the lack of a definition or something that we can bring to the data and say, is this correct? So that was pretty interesting to me. I'm going to skip the rest because they're kind of pretty obvious, but today I'll give you at least my answers, and I would say that, at least in my own research process, we're at the beginning of this process rather than at the end, but I'll give you what I know so far. Before I even start, let me acknowledge that economists are late to this party. We were early, as I will show you in a second, and then we were late. We're not so used to thinking about power. I often complain, perhaps mischaracterizing it, that we have reduced power in economics to mean market power, the ability to sell goods at a markup. But when we say that the US is powerful, or even that Google or JP Morgan are powerful, we must mean something broader than simply the ability to charge a markup. In political science, there are some very, very good concepts of power, and I'm going to show you my own rendition in economic models of these concepts. But I'm going to touch on two. The first is what is called relational power. I'm going to use a definition from Robert Dahl in 1957 that says, look, Andy has power over me to the extent to which he can get me to do something that otherwise I wouldn't want to do. You can see that it's relational because we're taking the world as given. It's about the relationship that Andy has with me. There is something deeper or more interesting that was put forward, among others, by Susan Strange that is called structural power. It's the idea that instead we're exerting power, we're building power by setting up the rules of the game or by affecting an entire equilibrium and shaping it in a way that it's in our favor. And then agents that participate in that world are, perhaps taking it as given, but worshiping the entire rules. Okay? So keep these ones in mind. Now, what is fair to say is that despite the fact that the political scientists were way ahead of the game in thinking about these concepts of power, they think very differently from economists. They're substantially more informal, more chit-chatty, and they recognize themselves that this is somewhat unsatisfactory. That if you want to take it to the data and say how much power do you have, who has power, what are the sources of power, you need to go much farther than these general definitions, although they're incredibly useful. Now, I said that economists were early and then were late. Please, go for it.
When you think of structural power, do you think the institution gives you like a presidency of United States gave you structural power, or do you think Trump is a structural power himself?
No, I think of it very differently. When I think of, I will show you formally, I think of it as you're affecting state variables, you're affecting the aggregate states, and you're understanding that your policies do, and you're shifting them in your favor. While the agents take them as given. Just let me make it trivial. China offers a contract on a port. The port authority takes national security as given, maximizes shareholder value. But suppose that China is doing it to the entire western seaboard of the US and Latin America. That's going to shift an entire equilibrium, including national security. It's that difference. It's about what do you internalize when you respond or when you exert power. That at least is going to be our rendition of this, okay, which is not the only possible one. Okay, so particularly for students, you probably have never heard of this, and if you haven't, I suggest that you read it. There is a landmark study that was written in 1945, in fact at Berkeley, where Andy and I did our work, by Albert Hirschman. Well, first, the guy is just very interesting. Okay, so he's a German Jew, escapes Germany during Nazism, moves to France, eventually has to move to southern France as the Nazi occupies Paris, is responsible for participating in having famous Jewish emigres move to the United States, people like Chagall or Ayn Rand. Also, he's very famous because he has a Netflix show. If you haven't seen it, it's called The Transatlantic. It's quite good. Now, for the purpose of what I care about, he lands in Berkeley. So he escapes southern France eventually. In 1944, he shows up at Berkeley, and he tries to get a job as a faculty member. And his ticket for the job is this book. So it's written by him as an economist, as a trade economist. And it's really an amazing book. Why? Because it does two things in my mind. First, it very simply dismisses that geoeconomics is mercantilism, that we're bargaining over a fixed amount of resources and we're simply figuring out who gets them. As an economist, we've long dismissed that notion because we think that as we bargain and exert power on each other, the pie is going to get bigger or shrink. So that this is unlikely to be a zero-sum game. At the same time, it's also quite dismissive of the English free traders, of the idea that if we commit to free trade, we're never going to think about power issues, that somehow trade will turn out to be all small and very evenly distributed. And so he thinks very heavily about asymmetries. Now, in his case, he was thinking about Germany building up power towards Eastern Europe and Italy in the run-up to World War II. But it's a very modern concept. And it's just really thinking about these power imbalances that led him to discover or build what today we know as the Hirschman-Herfindahl concentration index. Now I have two things to say about this. First, to substantiate the point I made that in economics we've reduced everything to be market power. Today almost all students know that index in the context of measuring market concentrations of firms for market power. Almost no students understand that the index was originally developed to understand concentrations of trading partners, what today we call trade dependencies. That's really where it comes from. Second, as a fun story, many years later, he writes an AAPMP that to me really exemplifies academic bitterness. This is a very short piece from a very accomplished man who complains that Herfindahl rediscovered the index after him. Gini never invented it, and he concludes the article by saying, but life is a bitter thing, which for somebody who had escaped Nazism, to conclude that life was bitter because of an academic dispute on the article is called The Paternity of an Index. I think we can all sympathize that sometimes we lose perspective. If you ever, that's the whole time I lied of lack of perspective. Now, to make it even more clear that I'm not making this up, just for fun, we pulled out all the Google Scholar citations of this book, and this was before LLM existed, so we had our arrays manually classified it into which of these citations come from economists versus political scientists or area studies, and so you can see that the book was originally cited in economics. Now, most of it is IO citing the index, but still it was among economists. By the 1980s, a huge field opens up in political science called IPE, International Political Economy, for which this is one of the foundational texts. And economies go the way of the dodo. So if my research agenda is successful, 10 years from now when we redo this, the red area will come up. But we're sort of, There have been papers, John McCarthy has a great paper on this. There's a few papers over the years, but this was like the fringe of our field, not the core. So hopefully we go back to being the core of this. Okay, so what am I going to do for the lecture? So they told me that the audience was largely academic, so I target this to academics, and in particular to people that might want to do work in this area. So really, I'm going to go through lots of stuff, but I'm going to start with, ultimately, out of everything we did, what did I really learn? What was the key insight? Really just three things. We spent a lot of time trying to get this nebulous topic into something that we could recognize as theory. It turns out that it really needed three ingredients. The first is to think of power as a participation constraint. Think of it as I'm giving you an inside option and an outside option. My power is going to be fundamentally related to the gap between the two. Those are going to be the things that I can ask you to do before you tell me to go away. Okay, and all of the manipulation of the equilibrium is going to be about, am I lowering your outside option or am I increasing your inside option? And it's going to be very, very helpful to think of it in those terms. The second is that rather than thinking of markups or a very specific version of power, has been thinking of the exertion of power as asking for costly actions. And so you can see the Robert Dahl definition at work. I'm asking you to do something that you wouldn't want to do. It's a costly action. It's privately costly to you, and what it really is a wedge in your first order conditions. Now, why are those wedges so helpful? Because 35 years of macro theory, public finance theory, macroprudential theory, we know how to handle lots of optimal policy problems the moment they're phrased as wedges in first order conditions. So many of our tools come in, and then everything becomes a special case, whether it's a tariff, an export control, a subsidy, industrial policy. All of that shows up in exactly the same form. So it's not a tool that we invented, it's a tool that we're using, but it gives you a very powerful way to think about how you exert power in which dimensions. And then the third thing, which really has to do with structural power, is this is what you were asking me, is thinking about externalities. Thinking about what I'm really doing by asking actions is I'm shifting the equilibrium. So I'm shifting aggregate externalities and price vectors. So if you're a trade economist, that's going to be in terms of trade manipulation. If you're thinking about technology, it might be external economies of scale. If you're thinking about the payment system, it might be strategic complementarities. We know since at least Greenwald-Stiglitz that a lot of this can be captured elegantly with an aggregate set of states, state variables that we carry as externalities. So fundamentally, if you understand these three things, that's 98% of what I'm going to show you. The rest is incarnation of these three objects. Once I strip it all down, that's really what made it work for us as a framework across many papers. There's not much else. Okay? You might think of it as bad news, but that's the naked truth. Okay, so I'm going to take these three concepts for a spin repeatedly. I'm going to start in a way that if you're an economic theorist, is going to annoy you because it's a little loose, and then I'm going to make it excruciatingly precise, and where if you're an empiricist, you're going to be half asleep because the notation gets horrible. Okay, but let me start with the, this is my reminder for two things. The first is to mention my co-authors. Everything I'm going to do is actually work with Chris and Jesse, so I'm just the one presenting. But they're really the ones doing the work. They just send me on trips so that they can do more work by themselves. And particularly at the end when I'm going to talk about AI, it's with my young colleague at Stanford, Antonio Coppola, who has told me pretty much everything I know about AI. So those are the papers. Now, I'm going to talk about what I did just because that's what I know. But you might not like it, or you might be more interested in this topic genetically. So I'll post the slides. There's a very long reading list at the end, which includes also great papers that are coming out and have already been written by other people in this field, but also a lot of what I had to read across political science and other fields to get a sense of the topic, and that might be very helpful to you. Okay, so there's a long reading list at the end. Okay, so let's do the loosey-goosey part. Just to start as an example, okay, let's pick a company, ASML. This is a company in the Netherlands that does advanced lithography machines for semiconductors printing. Okay? It has US suppliers. It has potentially Chinese customers, like SMIC, which is a foundry in China. If you think of the value of this firm privately, there is some aggregate state variable Z that might be the state of demand, technology, prices, and it's choosing optimally, given that, its own private choices. who to source from, how much to produce, who to sell to, at which prices. Okay? Now here comes the US government, and the US government has an objective. The objective is to get ASML to stop selling these machines to China. Okay? We're not making a claim that the objective is optimal, good. That's the objective. The costly action that they're asking this firm of is stop selling these machines to China. Now the problem is ASML is not a domestic firm. So if you're a domestic firm, the government has many of the usual things that it can do to you. It can regulate you, it can tax you, it can put export restrictions, there's lots of stuff. But if you're a foreign firm, I have to induce you to take the costly action that I want somehow. Well, I can do it two ways. I can certainly give you a positive inducement. I can pay for it. Or I can try to give you a negative inducement. I can try to specify what happens to you should you not comply with my demands. And the US allegedly went for the second one. They threatened the imposition of what is called the Foreign Direct Product Rule. It's a little known provision until recently of the Cold War that allows the US to directly regulate a foreign entity if they use any technology from the US at all. Essentially the threat is, if you don't do what I say, I'm going to put you on the entity list. What is the entity list? Is the list of foreign entities that no US person can do business with. So if you're ASML, that's a death sentence. So formally, what does that do? It moves the value function of that firm, if the threat is realized, way to the left. You can now operate, but you cannot do business with anybody in the US, whether they're suppliers, customers, or the people that service your bank, or in fact, Google for your email, or the people that run your database. Okay, so now you're way, way to the left. Now that immediately brings up the concept that I try to highlight. It brings up a participation constraint. What is the maximum value of costly actions that the US can ask out of this firm before the firm refuses is the difference between the inside and the outside option. And that's precisely what this keeps track of. Okay, so you can see that it's pretty useful. It formalizes a lot because now we're going to play games with, but what if I'm contracting with an entire industry? What if I'm asking ASML to do this because it affects another firm that I would like to bully? All of that is going to quickly fit into this area. And just to give you a preview, this comes from our econometrica paper, which has an incredibly long list of equations, but the insights are pretty straightforward. If you think of micropower, the relational power between me and Andy, it's really characterized here by the largest gap between letting you be, asking you for nothing, and letting you behave optimally, and you incurring the threat. For example, cutting you off from the inputs I control. That one correctly answers the maximum private value to Andy of the actions I can ask. It's very important that Andy is taking as given the entire world. He's not considering that as he does stuff, the whole world will change, okay? It's a private concept. In this sense, a sector is strategic if it lets the hegemon form very valuable threats on other sectors. Think of the payment system, okay? It's a very simple definition. It's one that you can take to the data. It's also, you will see as we make it more formal, that is one that tells you that most things aren't strategic. Because if I tell Andy that the punishment is not going to be able to advise me, he says, great, there's so many other great students, who the hell cares? There's a perfect substitute for me in another student in Berkeley. If you tell the world that you're not going to sell them pencils, they don't care. They care about lithography machines, presumably because it's very difficult to pick up an alternative. So all of that we're going to be able to make quite formal and take to the data. Macro power instead, you can see it, is the ability, as I collectively bargain with many entities, to direct their actions, not so much because of the direct value of the action to me, but because their actions help me shape the equilibrium in my favor. When the US intervenes so heavily on European firms not using Huawei technology or not selling semiconductors to China, we don't care about the technology directly. We care about the indirect effect that that has on the entire economy. Semiconductors is the typical case. They're valuable, but they're not that big. They're enormous if you're thinking about the impact on all of the downstream industries of having those semiconductors. So that's where it's going to come from. And if you're a theorist, you will see quickly that you can also measure that. It's going to tell you that the marginal value of power over a sector is going to far exceed the ability to exert costly actions if the sector is strategic in the macro sense, if it gives you indirect power. Okay? If this is very loose, I promised you it was loose, but now we're going to make it excruciatingly formal. Okay? So let's start. Please, Steve.
Are these something that I don't see how it fits into your framework that you sketched so far is the ability of large countries to alter the difference, the ability of large countries to alter the difference between the inside and the outside value. Yeah. So in your ASML example, China, for example, might want to cultivate its own domestic version of ASML, yes, which would greatly alter the equilibrium in which the United States and other countries can exercise this kind of geoeconomic power you're talking about.
It's a great question. Let me give you like a short answer now, and then we'll do it formally. So on the offensive side, the ability is going to come from the fact that as you ask each person to take an action, it's affecting the Zs. The Zs affect both the inside and the outside option, and potentially differently. It's a drug dealer model. I want everybody to be on this drug because then threatening each one of you with withdrawals gives me a lot of power. Collectively, as I get you all on the drug, each one of you doesn't realize that that's what's happening. Okay, so that's going to be one. On the defensive side, we will also say it. You're asking, okay, that's the theory of the offense. But on the defensive side, the governments understand that this might be happening, and what does optimal policy look like? And that's what we're going to characterize next. Other questions before I jump into equations? Okay, let me jump into the equations. Okay, so to make this stick, to make it formal enough that we can actually understand what we're doing, I'm going to sketch a simple model. I'm going to start with, please, go ahead.
So I'm just repeating myself. So is there only one hegemon in the model, or there could be scope for multiple different hegemons?
In everything I'm going to present today, there's only going to be one. We have worked out versions with multiple. We worked out a very simple, trivial one originally, and now we have a better paper that does both, but it's sufficiently new that I'm not going to have it in the slides. But I'm very happy, particularly at the end, to tell you more about that and where our thinking is. Things get intense from a technical perspective when you have multiple hegemons, but that makes life interesting again. Andy used to say, don't think of them as problems, think of them as things that you can solve, and that makes it a result. That's the issue. Okay, so let me start with one. Okay, so I have n countries. They're producing around the world. They have I sectors. Here, a sector is really an activity in a country. So think of Russian oil and American oil as being two different sectors. Now, there might be close to perfect substitutes in the way they enter the production function of other firms. Okay? And also, countries have some local factors like labor, okay, or materials. Each sector has a unit mass of firms. What are they doing? They're buying intermediate goods from other firms. So Xij is what firms in sector I imports from sector J. And they're using local factors, LIF. And they have a production function that is totally standard, except I'm going to use the Stiglitz trick. I'm going to stick into the production function potentially a very large set of aggregate variables that affect it. Now, what are they normally? If you think of, for example, external economies of scale, okay, typical of like trade models, those are going to be the total production of the sector. The bigger my sector, the more productive each one of us is. If you think of strategic complementarities that are very common in payment systems, they are the more other people are using the same payment system, the more me using it is productive for me. So this is a very convenient way to characterize them all from a theoretical perspective and then spatialize them in the examples. And each country has a representative consumer and government. So one of the things that I'm going to totally ignore for today is the domestic political economy, which is a big miss. And I can tell you some thoughts about it, but I'm going to totally ignore it. Okay, so the setup is pretty straightforward. Each country has a utility function over consumption. I'm also going to allow it to have a separable utility over activities taking place all over the world. So if you want to think of, for example, direct geopolitical things like, I don't want a large military sector in the other country. You can stick in the U or Z. I find it totally unsatisfying because we don't provide any theory of where these things come from. The only thing that is useful for is to the extent that you have them there, it's interesting to see how they translate into optimal policy, but clearly they require a much better theory of whether they're in the first place, which we don't have. The budget constraints are pretty straightforward. This is the consumption plan. I'm going to assume that each country owns its domestic firms. There is nothing wrong in this paper by assuming that you own some foreign firms. It's kind of interesting, but I'm not going to solve the endogenous acquisition of firms, so I'm going to stick to you own your domestic ones and then you have factor income. This defines a Marshallian demand. It tells you that given prices and your wealth, this is your optimal demand, and that's going to be my objective function. Okay, and then markets have to clear. So if a good gets produced, it either gets used as an intermediate input by somebody else or it gets consumed, and the local labor market or the local factor market has to clear locally. Okay? That's it. The structure of the economy is done. There's nothing else. Just think of, I mean, again, if you're a student, why are we doing it? We kind of wanted a reason why countries trade with each other, and we wanted an input-output matrix. Right? We wanted to consider what happens if I don't sell you a particular input and how it affects all other industries. So we started with a simple model of an input-output matrix globally and a very simple consumer objective function. Okay, the game where this comes alive is the policy game. So what I just described occurs at the end. You produce and you consume. In the middle, I'm going to have a theory of the offense. Okay, and to your question, there's going to be a single hegemon. It's totally exogenous. We're not solving where on earth you come from. What it is, a hegemon in this model, is really the following thing. You can threaten the foreign firms with disconnecting them, with not selling them inputs. So for today, I'm going to largely focus on what I call threats not to sell. I'm not going to give you something. You can also do threats not to buy. You can do many other things. But for today, I'm just going to focus in the talk on the threats not to sell. If you comply, I'm going to ask you to take on a bunch of costly actions from me and potentially to give me transfers. Now, in our first paper, the referees were incensed that a hegemon would ask for transfers. I'm going to leave it at that. You decide. There is no bad assumptions that we've made that with a little bit of time, the US administration doesn't validate. And I'm going to give all of the bargaining power to the hegemon for simplicity, so it makes it take it or leave it offers. Okay? That's the offense. I'm going to describe in a second what the optimal theory of the offense is from a micro and macro perspective. Then I'm going to go to the question that was asked by Steve. Okay, but the countries ahead of time know that this is coming. Okay, the difference with the offense is that the hegemon is doing it to foreign entities. Ex ante, everybody knows that this is going to happen. So every country is going to implement domestic policy on their domestic firms. Think of like industrial policy, trade policy, all of the typical things that you do ex ante to shape your economy, potentially to withstand being bullied later. So if you're thinking of, for example, a word that now is in the news a lot, economic security policy, that's going to be here. It's going to be how do I shape my economy to make sure that I'm not so dependent and exposed on the hegemon. Now it's going to be more interesting and more complicated because here I very much took the Hirschman view. Here the hegemon might be very benevolent. All else equal, the hegemon is better off by moving the inside option up, by, for example, providing public goods and making things work worldwide. So those things you want. But unfortunately, you also understand that it might turn out to be a bully and that you might want to do something about it. So the difference is that these wedges, you apply them to your domestic firms. For simplicity, I'm going to assume that over your domestic firms, you have full control. Okay? You can do versions where there is a participation constraint also domestically, and that's what a lot of the political economy will show up that we're ignoring. For now, I'm just going to say you can dictate their actions. Okay. That's all. There is nothing else. All the rest is solutions. Okay? Okay, so now let's look at the participation constraint in its full glory. Please.
Just a clarificatory question. So the hegemon continues to be hegemon if the rest of the world colludes, or?
No. That's actually an important question. The rest of the world plays Nash. So each one of them sets these wedges, they're going to be set taking as given what every other country in the world is doing with their own policies, but in full anticipation of what the hegemon will do tomorrow. So one of the, I mean, again, if you're looking for tractability, one of the nice things is, because we're playing Nash contemporaneously, it's very simple to solve, but because you're anticipating the hegemon bulling tomorrow, it's easy to characterize you affecting that. Okay? What's very difficult to do is full contemporaneous, like better protocols for bargaining. Those are difficult to do. Like my colleagues at Stanford, Kyle, loves doing Nash on Nash, and I use it in a multiple hegemon paper for that reason. It's kind of bad, but so tractable, so easy. This is even simpler in that sense, because we have a single one. Okay, let's look at the participation constraint in its full glory now. Okay, so let me start from the inside option. So if the firm accepts the contract, it produces with the full set of instruments, JI, the full set of inputs, undisturbed, except it needs to take on the costly actions that the hegemon is asking. They're going to be hidden in here. And I'm going to set them up so that they're rebated lump sum. The reason I do that is that I don't want the hegemon to have any revenue reasons to put the wedges in. I want him to be purely about dictating what you do, not about extracting revenue. You can change that. That's not that difficult, okay? If the firm rejects the contract, instead, it can produce with only a subset of the inputs. So it's lost all the stuff that the hegemon is now withholding, and now it's only subject to domestic policy. So it doesn't have to take any costly actions that the hegemon dictated, and it doesn't have to pay the transfers. Okay, so you can see that now this is pretty straightforward to characterize. The only other thing I need to put is the transfers, which are up there at the very top. Okay, those are the problems. The objective functions are pretty straightforward. The hegemon maximizes his own consumers. Wealth is the profits of the firms, the domestic firms, the factor income, but he also cares about transfers, okay? Because he gets them from the rest of the world. The rest of the world cares about the consumer in their own country. There's a set of firms that the hegemon cannot bully. For the ones that they bully, you care only about what you retain. So I'm factoring in that all contracts get accepted in equilibrium. That's the part that you retain. Okay? Good. That's it. Okay, so for the slides, I'm going to make some simplifications. Then I will show you the one without the simplifications. But let me start with like the one that is super simplified. First, I'm going to totally switch off the terms of trade. So I'm going to have linear utility. So the prices in equilibrium are constant. Second, I'm not going to play around with the extra term in the utility function because I don't have super intelligent things to say about it. Eventually, I'll show you with both. Please.
I do have a question. So when you for this one, when you try to exact influence on a target entity or target country, whatever. So he can do it directly by, for instance, asking his allies to cooperate, or through basically I see a network here, so he can do it in a more efficient way by affecting other allies' actions to jointly multiple like a coalition to change the action in a target firm or target
Yes.
entity. Yes.
So that's exactly what I'm going to play around with, except I'm not going to form coalitions in the proper sense. But I'm going to constantly be looking for, are you asking for an action because of the way it affects somebody else? And that's the efficient way to get what you want. That I'm going to do, but I'm not going to do formal coalitions. Okay, so let's make it super simple, okay, so that we can solve it in closed form. So let's specialize the production function and the world economy. So I'm going to consider an application to the payment system just because it's been in the news so much. The US has a single industry. It's got bankers that produce financial services out of local factors, linearly. The rest of the world is a collection of small open economies that are photocopies of each other. In each one of them, the only thing that matters is there is a domestic alternative. There is a sector H at home, which is the home financial services. And then there is an intermediary in the middle that takes the foreign financial services and the domestic one, puts them together into a composite bundle that he sells. Okay, so the important parts are here. The first one is if you start from the domestic alternative, I'm going to build it with an economy of scale. This is essentially Russia after the early invasion of Crimea. If you think that in the future you're going to be cut off from the US, you want to start scaling up the domestic financial system because it makes it more efficient. If everybody is used to having the same technology domestically to make payments, that technology is much more efficient. Okay? So it's a local external economy of scale. The global technology, the one that the US sells, instead has a strategic complementarity across the world. It's more attractive to use that system the moment other countries are also using it. Think of, for example, SWIFT, the messaging system. It's a bit like social media. You want to be on it because everybody else is on it. Okay? The value to you increases because everybody else is using it. So I'm going to hardwire it into the productivities that show up into the intermediaries that is a simple CS aggregator. Okay? So it's as simple as I can make it to get you to the solutions. Okay, so first, let's remind ourselves of what are two standard benchmarks of international macro. So one benchmark is you remove the hegemon, and every action is dictated by a benevolent global planner globally. What would the global planner want? It would want to subsidize both the domestic alternative and the global technology in proportions to their externalities. These size tell you how much more productive does the technology get as it gets used. So the standard solution for a global planner is you subsidize everything that has a positive externality. Here, both the domestic and the international one do. Okay, that's one standard solution. The other standard solution is the non-cooperative policy game. So take out the hegemon. Every country is dictating domestic policy. It's essentially doing industrial policy. It's deciding how much to subsidize the use of domestic technology or the use of the global one. What is the standard outcome, which is unsurprising? The first is this zero. This is a collection of small open economies. None of the countries think that they can affect how productive the world technology is. They neither tax it nor subsidize it. The second one is the domestic externality. You fully internalize it because it only occurs in your own economy, so you subsidize it just like the planner would have. So it's a standard result that in a Nash policy game, you tend to under-tax negative externalities and under-subsidize positive one if they're occurring cross-border, because you don't see them. The question is going to be what happens when we play the game with the hegemon and anti-coercion. So let's solve it. So first, let's go back to the concept of the participation constraint and do it graphically. So here a firm, the intermediary in the target country, has a constant marginal revenue because I made prices constant. So the marginal revenue curve is constant and flat. The marginal cost curve is increasing because I have decreasing returns to scale at the firm level. So the value of the firm undisturbed is the area between these two curves. That's the standard micro. If the hegemon cuts you off from using the global technology, your marginal cost curve is going to shift weakly to the inside. We don't know by how much, but clearly you're worse off because you cannot use at least one of the inputs. This very, very simple intuition gets you 90% of the way there in the Hirschman logic. Why? Because it describes a fundamental conflict between the hegemon and the rest of the countries and the planner. So the planner cares about what? The global planner cares about the inside option. He cares about making that area as big as possible. The hegemon cares about the difference between the inside and the outside option. So you can see that all else equal, the hegemon here is benevolent, pushing the inside option out, making the world better on path. It's a good thing. It does increase power. The problem is that making the world worse, if you cut them off, pushing the marginal cost curve on the outside option to the left, it's also good for increasing power. The countries care about what they retain. That's again a level. So the fundamental problem is hegemons care about power, which is a gap in inside versus outside option. Welfare for the rest of the world is dictated by levels. How much economic activity gets place. So when is an hegemon extractive? Is when it's strictly better off destroying value at the inside option in order to make you really dependent on them. When you're a drug dealer. Here I rigged it to be very aggressive, in fact. What does the hegemon want to do? Well, first, you can see the top equation. That's the subsidy that he asks you to impose on the use of his own technology. It's very similar to what the planner would do. The hegemon fully internalizes, this gives to Steve's question, that as each one of you adopts the technology, it makes it more productive for everybody else to want to be on it, and that's good for the hegemon. So here the hegemon wants to hyper-globalize, globalize more than the planner would have liked, because it makes it very central. It creates dependency on everybody else. Where does it behave very differently? It behaves very differently from the planner because it tells you that you need to stop scaling up the domestic alternative. I don't want you to have an alternative, and I'm going to tell you that the cost of dealing with me and having access to my technology is no alternative. This is going to sound familiar from Twitter and truth messages that threaten all sorts of things if countries build alternatives. That's what the demand is. So it's an over-globalized world in which globalization far exceeds what the planner would have liked because it creates a ton of dependency. Now let's think about what the rest of the world does in anticipation. Well, anti-coercion policy in this framework is very simple. It's just trying to push the marginal cost curve back up. The hegemon wants you to have no alternative. Your job as a policymaker domestically is to make sure that you're not so dependent, that your firms do have a decent alternative. And you can see that half of the policies of, for example, Europe right now or Asia right now are aimed at not having a lot of dependency on either the US or China, whether it's financial or rare earths or other materials. That's really what they are. Okay, let's look at what that optimal policy looks like. I rigged it to be an extreme. Here, the optimal anti-coercion policy is full fragmentation. You tell your firms that they cannot use the hegemon technology, and then you correctly subsidize the domestic one. There is nothing generic about this insight. You will see in a second why I chose it. The general theory will tell you that what you try to do is you try to walk back the dependency. You try to scale up the alternative. It's inefficient compared to the planning solution because you're essentially self-insuring. You're not that good at this thing. It would have been strictly better off to depend on the world technology, but you need a good alternative. So if you put it here, you can see how I rigged the game. I made sure that all of the home alternative solutions are identical, and then the entire game varies on what's happening to the cross-border part. And I wanted to make sure that we got a full ban because it delivers a very important policy insight, which is here the hegemon has all the power, but it's perceived to be so extractive and so coercive that ex ante, every country walks away. This is like, a theory of the Mark Carney speech before the Mark Carney speech, that, if you're not at the table, you're dinner. It's exactly what's going on. Here in equilibrium, the hegemon ends up with no power at all. It dissipates his entire power by being perceived to be overly coercive, which brings up a couple of interesting insights. The first is that really the bad news, which is when I started this project, I was curious whether the trade-off between economic security and the gains from trade was an accidental one or a deep one. It turns out to be a very deep one. Think of what we teach undergraduates about the standard trade theory, that the gains from globalization occur because of specializations and economies of scale. Andy specializes in one thing, me in another, we both get good at this, and then we trade with each other. Embedded into that logic, there is the idea that if I pay the price, it's going to sell me the goods, that it cannot hold me up. I just took that logic and I had then a hold-up problem. Now, inspect the original argument, the one that you're familiar with, and you will see the problem. In the original argument, the technology that I didn't pursue, that I let Andy specialize in, I'm now not good at. My outside options are bad if it cuts me off because I never specialize in those things. That was both the source of the gains and the source of the dependency. So the two are the same mechanism. It's a very, very deep trade-off. It's not that somehow these two things turn out to be correlated in equilibrium. It's the same logic that generates them. That's bad news because it tells you that part of what we might be seeing now is that having realized that we might be cut off, we're simply choosing a different point on that trade-off. We would like to be a little bit more secure at the cost of giving up some of the gains from trade. So that's why I ended up calling it Krugman mixed geoeconomics. It's kind of the same mechanism, just viewed a different way. It also tells you that as long as you don't do coalitions, if you do Nash policy, there is a doom loop. Why? Because each one of us tries to fragment to feel secure. As we do it, we don't take into account that the moment Germany is not part of the system, Italy starts to feel that the system is not so attractive anymore. It starts to fragment. But then Africa will start to feel that the system is not so attractive. They start to fragment. What we end up with in an uncoordinated equilibrium is overly secure at the expense of giving too much, giving up too much of the gains from trade. That can be improved with policy coordination. I mean, the typical example I give, at least in Europe, is, we don't want to have a steel mill in Italy, France, and Germany. It's kind of enough that we coordinate on perhaps one in the entire union, gets you along the way there. It also brings up the last point, which is why I rigged the problem to have an infinite tax. This is something that I massively changed my mind of, and my colleague at Stanford, Kyle, has worked, for example, in the context of the WTO on this, which is a commitment issue. So I always thought of international organizations, like if you ask me as a theorist, model the IMF, model the WTO, I would have started with a global planning problem and then thinking of these institutions at that implementation. Now I totally changed my mind. I would start with a hegemon that has a commitment issue. Everybody is afraid that they're going to get bullied. It's going to commit to a set of rules that lets countries trust the hegemon, be in its economic network, and leave him some power. And so I really think of it's important for theory, but it's also important from a practical perspective, which is we've sold a narrative in the US that these commitments are for the foreigners. I think it would be good to remember that these are commitments that the US put forward in its own self-interest and benefit the US very directly. I don't think I'm going to have it in the slides formally, but it's easy to do it intuitively. Think of the model I just presented. The hegemon has no power in the. So imagine the hegemon said, look, I'm going to bully you, but I'm going to leave you a fraction of the surplus. Well, if the fraction is 0, it's only good for the foreigners. The hegemon has no interest. If the fraction is I take everything, we go back to I have no power because you're too scared. Somewhere in the middle, you're going to trust me. I'm going to have some power. I'll bully you a little bit, but you and I will both be better off. So it's a commitment that is unilateral on the hegemon, and yet it makes it better off. And I think it's a much better view of multilateral commitments than what I had originally for many years thought of. Steve. Here you go.
Your last point, which is a good one, it seems to me it's incomplete in the following sense. Part of what's happened in the last few years, especially under Trump too, is a violation of the United States' own internal commitments on executive action.
Yes.
Though that would be an important consideration, or even aside from these international organizations, because the U.S. Constitution says if you have a Senate ratified treaty, that is a superior law that the executive branch is supposed to abide by. Of course, the Trump administration has violated this. It's already been litigated once before the Supreme Court. We're probably headed there for more litigation. The point is that aside from these international organizations, the hegemon's capacity to bind itself internally also affects the extent to which you can encourage participation on terms that are good for the rest of the world and for the hegemon. Yes. In this global order, I'll call it that, which
yes.
is sketched out here. So that seems to me like point 4, you haven't quite got the full story there.
In so many ways, but also in this one. First of all, I agree 100%. Here I'm focusing very much on the international aspect, in part because I mentioned I wasn't going to work on the domestic side. Now, since it's interesting, let me mention 2 thoughts now on the domestic one. First, in this model, there is a very clear conflict between the government and its own firms. So let me think of NVIDIA. Okay? So what NVIDIA would like to do is it would like to be a monopolist. It means sell to everybody, restrict the supply, sell at high prices. Think of what the US would like NVIDIA to do. It would like it to sell to everybody but China at very low prices. You want to flood the market. You want to flood the market, make it very difficult to build an alternative and retain power and punish China. So you can see that that's a conflict between the firm and the government. that's going to bring up all sorts of issues about domestic commitment. Very often, particularly in Asia or in Latin America, I ask the following question, which is, well, China as an autocracy and as a big presence of state-owned enterprises is a big advantage in this game because it can dictate the actions. And the US has all sorts of domestic constraints. And I say yes, but that's taking as given the industries we have. Imagine what would happen in the US if we tell Silicon Valley that every time they're going to innovate, the US will take over the firms in the national interest or might require a 16%, whatever we want to call it, like an equity stake. Are we going to have a dominant sector to exert power later? The technology isn't invariant to that. So there's plenty of interesting things to do in that space that we haven't done yet. But here we're really focusing on the international aspect. Okay, I promised the general theory it's ugly, so here it is. The only reason to build it up, to bring it up, is that it gives you a bit of a more generic sense of what these models work like as a framework. In particular, I'm going to sort of only sketch a few things. The bottom two equations are what we're used to as standard equations in the field. I care about this activity taking care in the rest of the world because it affects the equilibrium. I only care for two reasons. Either it affects my utility directly, it's the military, or because it affects the profits of my firms. So I want to distort things abroad because it makes life easy for my firms. The second one is an even more classic effect, which is I care about moving this activity because it moves prices, and I care about terms of trade manipulation. I want to sell my goods expensive and buy cheap. That's the typical, the classic theory of a tariff is a terms of trade manipulation. That's it. This is here, in a much more general sense. The top two are what's novel to this framework. Why? Because they're only there because of the participation constraint. So several of you have asked me, oh, but are you going to manipulate the inside and the outside options? Here they are. I care about moving this activity because it moves the equilibrium, and then I care about how that impacts the outside option and the inside option of everybody that I can bully. And I care about that through the externalities or through the prices. So you can see that, for example, the terms of trade manipulation and building power might be in conflict with each other. Terms of trade manipulation says I want to sell expensive, but here I want to sell cheap and generate dependency. Okay, but as a general theory, it has a lot of the classic insights and then the new stuff that comes from power, which is why I told you, look, ultimately, this was really about putting a participation constraint in there. Now you can see it, you can see it more generally. Okay, very good. I'm going to start doing data. So if I bored you to death with a bunch of equations so far, I'm sorry, but I'm now going to bore you to death in a different way, which is with a bunch of equations plus data. But we can do that. And I'm going to do it in two different ways. One that is familiar to most economists and is incredibly familiar to trade economists, which is thinking about sufficient statistics with hard data to infer how much power do you really have. And then I'm going to do something that instead is unfamiliar to all economists, including me, which is using artificial intelligence and text to get to this from a different perspective. Okay? So let me start with the part that we all understand. Suppose that I take the previous model and I parameterize the hell out of it. I do what the trade economists love to do, which is nesting a lot of stuff. In particular, I start with the following. Each economy has a representative producer that is buying things from abroad. Various varieties that are being sourced all over the world. So I'm buying semiconductors from many, many countries. Then I combine what I bought from abroad with my domestic alternative. And this seems innocuous, but I'm going to return to this because a lot of the empirical problems with the data have to do with the domestic part. Eventually, I take all these industries, I put them together, and then at the end, I'm going to add finance to this. Okay? So it's a simple aggregate nested CS. If you're a trade economist, you know results like ACR tell you that the way you can infer what would have happened if you didn't have access to something is to look at the equilibrium expenditure shares and some elasticities and use the structure of the model to infer what would have happened. Normally, we think of that calculation when we do autarky. What if you lost access to all foreign inputs? But very much the same type of math will work out if you're losing access to only a subset of the inputs. Okay, it's a little bit more complicated, but I'm not going to get into the details. But an ugly formula like this is familiar to all of you. This little index here is what fraction of everything that I buy abroad do I buy from the hegemon. This big omega here is what fraction of the industry do I produce domestically versus buy from abroad. This is the fraction of that industry across industries, and this is the combination with finance. Okay? Now, what is the power? The power is that think of the way I set up the model with a participation constraint. I want to know the difference between the inside option and the outside option. The outside option I don't observe most of the time. You do not get cut off. So how do I know how bad is your life if you get cut off? I use this formula. I use the structure of the model and the data that I observe on the equilibrium to infer what would have happened off the equilibrium path. That's where a lot of the quantitative trade theory comes in. Now the good news is that these omegas, you largely see them in the data. What do you import from other countries, for example? The bad news is that the blue stuff are elasticities. That stuff, not only do you not see it, but we tend not to agree as economists on what those numbers are, and they're quite important. To make a baseline calibration simple, I'm going to use the idiot law of elasticities, which is if you don't know them, set them to 1 and do Cobb-Douglas. So I'm going to do outer Cobb-Douglas, and then I'm going to take the inside elasticities to be what Arnaud and Rodriguez-Clare set. And I'm going to assume that stuff that you buy from abroad is much more substitutable with each other than with the domestic variety, which is a standard assumption, for example, from Finstra with Maury Opsfold. And I'm going to assume that finance, the payment system, is very hard to substitute from. I'm just going to crank it to have a very low elasticity. Okay, do all this, and a couple of things emerge. The first is a simple insight that turns out to be very powerful in practice, which is the nonlinearity of power. This is not something that we invented. It's a standard property of our models, but in geoeconomics it's quite crucial. Inspect the inner basket. It tells you that a sector, it's really crucial to have access to if the hegemon controls almost all of it, little omega is close to 1. So if the hegemon is very dominant, it gets a lot of power. Or trivially, if the elasticity of substitution is getting close to 1. In Cobb-Douglas, if you lose access to one variety, you lose them all. Okay? Now, I'm going to argue that that nonlinearity of the little omega is empirically relevant. So to justify it, I took the trade data and I plotted the Kernel-smoothed densities of bilateral trade shares with the US coalition. This was written in unsuspecting times, so it includes Mexico, Canada, Western Europe, and the Chinese coalition. Now, when we say that China is a large exporter in manufacturing, we mean this red curve. That for many bilateral destinations, 20, 30% of all imports come from China. I mean, if you think of it as China alone, that's an enormous import penetration in foreign markets. If you look at finance, of course, financial services, China is not dominant. When you look at finance for the US, particularly given the Western coalition, this is where you get the nonlinearity. There are many countries that get almost all of their financial services from the West. I mean, essentially, once you account for the US, London, Brussels, so Belgium in general, Luxembourg, that's the vast majority of global basic financial services. And we're not talking the sophisticated stuff like hedge funds. We're talking the plain vanilla, super boring things like custody of assets, being able to make payments. That's really where the US gets a lot of power. So hold to this thought, because I'm going to return to it. It has a couple of important things. The first is, you all heard the word choke points being thrown around. To an economist, a choke point is a sector that has these characteristics. It has a very dominant player, the US dominates financial services, has a very low elasticity of substitutions, very hard not to deal with the Western payment system, very poor alternatives, and it's important for the rest of the economy. So it makes other sectors collapse. That's a very, very simple, familiar definition to demystify what the word choke points might actually mean. Now, it also teaches you something important for Singapore. In fact, I often use Singapore as an example, which is power is not additive. It's non-linear. If you lose power, it doesn't accrue to somebody else. So think of the strategic importance of Singapore as a financial center. To the US, Singapore is absolutely crucial on the offense side. if Singapore comes along with US sanctions on a country, you leave them with no alternative. It pushes you into close to 100% dominance. For China, Singapore is important on the defensive side. It's about not having the US be so dominant. For China, even if you were to control Singapore, it's not going to make it a financial superpower. Having between 0 and 5% of the world financial services doesn't give you any power. So the power doesn't have to go from one to another. It also tells you something very important, which is what we're going to see in a second. Most sectors aren't strategic. Most trade isn't a dependency. Most things in the data look like there are plenty of alternatives and very high elasticity of substitutions. There are very, very few sectors that will qualify for these definitions. It also tells you that contrary to the Hirschman view, having no dependency isn't about trade that is equally distributed across all sectors. It's really about moving away from a few corners. And so optimal policy is really about very few things, and most trade you just want to let it be. It's totally beneficial and generates no dependency. Instead, in the data, very often we look at the shares and we get very worried, but you forget that, for example, most of what China sells is stuff with extremely high elasticity of substitutions. If you're buying washing machines, it's not a big dependency. If you're getting your payment system or your cloud computing done from somebody else, yeah, that's a different story. Okay, good. So if you bring them to the data, this is what the US coalitions look like. These are expressed in percentage losses to the targets. So you can see that for the US, a lot of power comes from the blue bars. That's finance. Some of it comes from all other sectors. You can see that Singapore, clearly because it's such a small open economy, relies a lot on trade, so the threat of being cut off, of course, is very big for Singapore. When you look at China, almost all of it comes from manufacturing, Singapore being the exception. I don't have to explain it to you. China has deep financial ties and financial services with Singapore. This you can do in many different ways. Those formulas are very flexible. There's like 30 years of quantitative trade theory that you can bring to bear. So you can see that the game I played was do the theory, rig it in a way where not only the participation constraints are useful theoretically, but there are things that you have a hope to measure into the data because you can think of a lot of the counterfactuals of trade, which they develop a lot of technology for, can be brought to bear on these questions. So that's part of the advantage. Now, this measurement is at the beginning. Where are the bodies buried? Well, at least in two places. The first is you might think that a lot of choke points occur at very disaggregated level. Rare earths, the particular type of semiconductors. Not only does the data deteriorate as you go finer and finer, but also if we can barely agree on elasticities at a very aggregate level, our ability to determine the elasticity of substitution between a very top chip and the one below, you made it up. Now, making it up, I don't mean it as a bad thing. Making it up is very helpful. Why? Because it tells you what you have to believe. I think of those calculations, not that I have any confidence that they're correct. It tells you that if you want to say that losing those semiconductors is going to get you 7% of GDP losses, you better believe something about those formulas. You better believe, for example, that the elasticities are incredibly low and that those sectors have a huge indirect influence on the economy. So they're putting a constrained jacket on policy discourse, even with all their imperfections, okay? The other place where there is a lot of issues is the domestic data. So for Singapore, that's not a huge issue. You're a very open economy. But for a continental size economy like the US, Western Europe, China, the domestic firms are the first port of call if you lose access to imports. Unfortunately, domestic data is horrible, even in highly developed countries. Why? Because, well, custom offices have existed for hundreds of years to tax things at the border. So goods crossing borders we track, great. Services crossing borders we barely track, which is a big issue. But goods moving domestically we pay no attention to. Unfortunately, from a national security perspective, that's a huge black hole. Okay? And a lot of data collection has to occur in that space before we have decent answers. Right now we don't. And you can do a little case study, but from a systematic perspective, that's really where you fall short. Okay. The last 15 minutes or so, I'm going to play around with something that many of us don't know. The only person I know is Steve Davis, who's worked on text for a very long time, which is using text to get at these questions in a very different way. And this is really, I should have mentioned at the beginning, this is really work with my young colleague Antonio Coppola, who's an expert on AI, so I really learned a lot from him on this. Okay, so first, why would you want to do it? Well, so far in the other approach, I had to infer threats by saying, suppose that they were to cut you off. The model might tell you what happens. That doesn't tell me whether the threat was ever made. And it's obvious to all of us that the most powerful threats are the ones that you're not going to see in the data. When the US tells the ASML, do this or you got a business, they do it. When the US tells a European bank, stop trading with Iran or you lose access to the US financial system, they do it. Text is very helpful though, because the CEO of those companies might on the record have to answer questions about why they stopped selling machines to China, why they're stopping to trade with Iran. That text is precious that way. Also text, and this really comes from Steve Davis' Insights with Nick Bloom, it's great about uncertainty. They're going to think about, oh, Trump just got elected, we're very uncertain about tariffs 6 months down the line, well before this shows up in the hard data. Okay, good. So that's what we wanted to do. We wanted to think about export controls, tariffs, sanctions, just measure them a different way. If you're very familiar with AI, what I'm going to tell you is entirely superficial. If you're not familiar with AI, this is the best 2 minutes of your life. So this is what my co-authors had to explain to me. So imagine what you would do, okay? So suppose that you had all of these documents. You had, for example, every earning calls and analyst report on all public firms worldwide. Okay, so it's like 1.2 million documents. A long time ago, what would you do? You would write a long questionnaire, instructions, tell your arrays, go read these documents, and transform each one of them into a long list of variables that I want you to do. Okay, that's doable, but it's pretty hard. To give you an example, when we ask one of our arrays to do this for one document, it takes them about 25 minutes. A better version of this is what, for example, Steve and Nick pioneer, is using natural language processing to do this. So if you're low skill like me, I think of it as command find. You're just saying in the document, do they ever mention the word tariff? Now it's a lot better than that, because what you would actually do is you would say, look, I'm looking for combinations of 2 or 3 words that are key to me, and I'm going to compare how frequently do they appear in the document to a baseline version of the English language or of documents of that kind. So a lot of the natural language processing of the last 20 years, it's essentially that. Now AI has shifted the frontier enormously. What large language models do, the reason why we're also enamored with them when we chat online with ChatGPT or Anthropic, is that they're very, very good at capturing sophisticated content in context in the text. What's really happening is something called cross-attention. AI is putting weights on the entire text, potentially on words that are very far apart from each other, and has learned in a very nonlinear way to interpret how those words are related to each other. What it's really doing is it's removing one of the words at each time and saying, can I predict what that word should be? That's why it's so good at text. Now, basically what that means is that you can extract now information from this text that is incredibly sophisticated. For example, we're going to ask for things like, is the firm affected by tariffs? But if so, how? Are they facing higher input prices? From which destinations? Are they reacting by increasing their product prices? To which other countries? Are they changing a supplier? Which country is imposing the tariff on which other country? So think of it as exactly the questionnaire that you would have given your arrays done from a machine. So basically what prompts is the questionnaire. The text is what I just described. In the middle, you have an algorithm from LLMs that then spits out a structured data set. Now, I'm going to spend only a few seconds on this, but it's interesting if you're going to do this for yourself. There's a couple of different versions of LLMs that you can use. Well, first, you can trade your own neural network. There's reasons to do that. That's not what we did. We use the frontier general purpose models. Those come in two varieties, what are called closed weights. Those are ChatGPT, Anthropic. You never see the model. They might change it in the background. You have somewhat limited control, but they're very advanced, and you generally have very cheap calls to their APIs. Well, not for the frontier ones. What we use is something else. We use what are called open weights models. These are models where you have the model, is sitting on our Stanford server. It's not going to go anywhere. We have it. We make it totally deterministic. So if you're freaking out about every time I ask ChatGPT the same question, the answer changes, that has something to do with the temperature of the model. You can make it as deterministic as MATLAB or Stata. You press the button a million times with same question, same data, it's going to give you the same answer. Okay? So it passes that very narrow concept of replicability that makes me somewhat more comfortable. So that's what we did. Okay? Good. So what comes out of this? Well, first, let's go back to the example I did at the very beginning on ASML. So if you run all of the text of ASML to the algorithms for the period 21 to 25, what does it spit out? That the countries imposing the pressures are the US and the Netherlands, that the target of the pressure is China, that the products involved are extreme ultraviolet and deep ultraviolet systems, that the impact on the firm is negative. This is a costly action. That the ask was to lower sales and the country was China. Now the beauty of the text is that you can then run this up and down the supply chain. I can run this on the text of the US suppliers to SML. I can also run the text on the Chinese customers. They no longer have access to this. How are they reacting? Is it expensive, not expensive? Are they getting it somewhere else? So think of doing this systematically for all firms around the world. Okay, so let's play around with the aggregates. First is export controls. This is percentage of public firms worldwide that are affected by this policy. You can see that this used to be nothing and has become more and more popular as a policy. The orange area is the US exerting pressure over China. The green area that opens up at the very back end is China retaliating with rare earths against the US. This is sanctions. I mean, these graphs at the aggregate, you could have gotten them with simpler methods. The countries gets a little complicated, but the aggregates are pretty simple. So for sanctions, you have clearly the first invasion of Ukraine, the US sanctioning Huawei and ZTE and Iran, and then clearly the second invasion from Russia. When you look at tariffs, you have Mr. Trump 1 and 2. They're on everybody, which we will return to. Okay, but now you want to go a lot deeper. These are kind of like easy warm-up results. The graph kind of makes sense. They look like what you would expect. First, you can start thinking about who's exerting pressure on whom, using what across instruments. So here I have it for export controls. Clearly for export controls, it's mostly the US targeting China via things that are in the supply chain of semiconductors. The retaliation is mostly China targeting the US via metals and minerals. Those are the magnets, the rare earths, some of the pharmaceutical products. And then there's a scattering of everything else. But you can go a lot deeper. Oh, maybe. Okay. Okay, who knows? Okay, so let's go back to the nonlinearity of power, which I highlighted. So first, let me put it on a graph. So the theoretical surface is just the index I showed you before. It tells you that a sector, you have a lot of power over a target if you control something where they spend close to 100% of their resources on you, and if it has a very, very low elasticity of substitution. Okay, that's our simple definition of you have no alternative. So a choke point in this sense is a sector up here. Now here I put as black dots what the US coalition versus China looks like in the data. Of course, they're going to be off the model because there are other things that entered the formula, not just a simple index. But now you can ask, okay, suppose that I look at export control policy. Did the US use the logic of the model to choose which sectors are being used to damage China? In some sense, you're asking, did they pick strategically sectors up here, or did they pick at random sectors down here? This also reminds you of what I just said in graphical form. Most sectors aren't strategic. Most sectors don't cause large damage. Okay, it's very few things. Okay, this is the AI. This is, we look at firms in each sector and we say, what is the likelihood that their report being used to target China? And you can see that it's a little bit of the Jake Sullivan famous quote of, I want a small garden with a very high fence. The US used few sectors a lot. And they don't look random. I mean, there's clearly noise, but they're clearly in the right region. There's a few, this is, I think it's aircrafts, which then Trump eventually used. The one that they don't use is autos. But this is semiconductors, and clearly they use very little of everything else. So US export control policy looks like the model. If you do tariffs, it looks nothing like the model, right? I mean, we tariffed everybody, including penguins. Okay, it's just totally random. Now, what we're working on right now is to shift this picture and look at the other side and say, did the firms on the receiving end report that this was expensive for them? On this side, we're simply asking, did the US use this model to pick? That doesn't make the model right. I want to know that those firms are disproportionately affected. Similarly, the fact that the US administration didn't use the model to decide tariffs, it's great for us because we can test when they use the wrong stuff, whether it really doesn't matter for the foreigners because you can sell to somebody else. Okay, that's what we're working on right now. Okay, so let me show you a little bit of what we've done in this direction. I divided firms into firms in the countries receiving the pressure and firms in the country imposing the pressure. Okay? Let me focus on this side. This is essentially China. So this is negative for the firms. That's pretty straightforward. But here's the interesting part. What are the Chinese firms reporting? Their major reaction is doing R&D. It's all domestic R&D to try to build an alternative, okay, which is a response that you would imagine. Now, the US firms also report R&D of a very different kind. One of the nice things about tech is that you can inspect the rationale. This is NVIDIA saying we're doing R&D to figure out a chip that is sufficiently powerful that the Chinese want it and the US administration hasn't banned it. So they're just working around the constraint. It's a different, kind of different problem. Okay, so suppose that we focus on tariffs. These are US firms. First, US firms overwhelmingly report being negatively affected from tariffs. There are a bunch of firms that report being positively affected from tariffs. Now, I took trade with Andy as a student, and what I'm going to show you next is great news for basic trade theory, because the data looks exactly like you would imagine. So I divided the firms into those that report being positively and negatively affected. The profit margins are exactly what you expect. They simply answer the same question. What's interesting is up here. Okay, so I'm not going to test the students in the audience, but a tariff is a consumer tax and a domestic producer subsidy. Okay, it's two policies at once. So now you can see them. What is the first part is the firms that are negatively affected are much more likely to report that as a consequence of the tariff, they're facing higher input prices compared to the firms that are positively affected. Yet both firms are much more similar in reporting that they are increasing their own prices in response to the tariff. What is going on? That's the producer subsidy. The firms that are positively affected are those firms in the data that didn't import from abroad, their competitors did, their competitors are increasing prices because they're being tariffed. They themselves are not subject to the tariff. Now they have two options. One option is keep the prices the same, gain market share, or increase your own prices, therefore make more profits. That's the subsidy. It's essentially the steel mill in the US that says, my competitors were all getting steel from Mexico, they're getting tariffed, I was always sourcing domestically, I'm now going to get a bigger market share and being able to increase my prices because my competitors are. Okay, that's where it's coming from. Now, when you look at what the administration wanted out of this, which was domestic investment, it only shows up for the firms that are positively affected. But those, at least by count and also by market value, are a small fraction of the data. Okay? Okay, I'm going to stop here for the last 2 minutes just for fun. If you're interested in these things, we put it all online 2 weeks ago. So we put it all online at the firm level. every transcript run through AI, all of the answers of the firms, and we built a nice little graphical interface that you can play around with. So to give you an example, I picked, of course, Singapore. These are tariffs. You can see that it's mostly the US on China that is affecting the Singaporean firms. But you can go down to the firm level. So first let me do sanctions. You can see that it's mostly instead the US and the European Union on Russia and Iran that show up. Those things make sense. But you can go down to the firm level. So what did I pick? For sanctions, I picked BOC Aviation. It's a Singapore-based company that is the largest leaser of private aircrafts. They got pretty affected by US sanctions on Russia because they lost a bunch of planes that were in Russia when the sanctions occurred. They've been in litigation ever since. So you can see what the AI does alive. It tells you that there's a current effect, there's a future effect, it's negative, what are the countries, what is the product, it's an aircraft, and what are they doing? They're delaying doing stuff, and there's a supply chain adjustment. And the nice thing is that it gives you a nice little summary of what the firm said about this. You can do the same for tariffs. I picked Hutchinson Port Holdings. This is clearly a Chinese company. They have a trust that is listed in Singapore. And what they're doing is they're clearly saying the firm discusses tariffs and their impact on its business. But specifically, the CEO mentions that the company is concerned about the impact of tariffs on the US that are coming from China. What are they doing? They're thinking about increased costs due to tariffs and passing some of this cost to the customers. So they're thinking about raising their own prices to the US. This is all online. If you're interested in these things, go knock yourself out, and please send us comments. It is AI generated. So one of the things I'm not going to talk about today is all of the problems with AI, which is the things it gets wrong, the things that might have measurement error, biases. There's a very active econometric literature that we're also working on that I'm not going to touch for the purpose of today, but it's pretty fun. Okay, let me conclude here. Look, I just cannot think of a bigger issue than geoeconomics for the next 10 years. And perhaps beyond. This is going to deeply affect the world we live in. It's also an issue where I would argue that economists have many intelligent things to say. And it's one where collectively, even if we move the policy discourse just a little bit in the right direction, this is so consequential that moving it even a little bit is going to be a lifetime achievement. I just can't think of anything else. I mean, I wake up every day and I just think about this. There is so many things to do. There's just multiple hegemons. There's the political economy. I didn't even mention the duality with military. There's just lots of data issues and measurements. The measurement I showed you is nothing but like rudimentary. We want to know causality. We want to know policy counterfactuals. We want to be quantitative. We want to say, should the optimal policy be a 2% export control, a 10% export control? How far off are we from optimal policy? Ultimately, like as a collective effort, I'm actually pretty positive on our profession. Once we get involved, we do stuff. And there's just so many people right now doing amazing work on this that I'm pretty positive. But if you're particularly a young person in the audience, hopefully I gave you a bit of a sense of what we did. You get to do a lot better, show us all the ways in which we're wrong and how you're going to do it 10 times better. It's really a worthy pursuit for your life. So I hope I generated at least some interest. That's it. Danny. Oh, and I promised the long reading list, so I wasn't kidding. It's here.
Thanks. Thanks, Matteo, for a wonderful lecture. Your overall framework for geoeconomic analysis is very impressive. I wonder, if I may, to push a bit on the boundaries where you're feeling it might or might not be successful already. The first point is, in your framework, how do we explain the hegemon actively undermining international organizations? Now, your item 4 on things that we have learned seems to work in the opposite direction. The hegemon is trying to seem cuddly, because otherwise it is overly coercive. It's trying to bring everyone back. But the reality is, over the last 5-10 years, the hegemon has actively undermined international organizations, whether it's WHO, which has already left, WTO, which it has paralyzed, and so on, right down the list. So I'm keen to understand how your framework helps us think about that. Second, very closely related, is in your framework, how do we explain the hegemon tearing up the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, and then allowing CPTPP to flourish? Both of those actions seem to undermine the effectiveness of your participation constraint, and I'm unclear how you would explain that. But finally, if I may, I'm sure you've already thought about how you generalize your participation constraint beyond the market access idea. Because if it were purely market access, America is going to lose every time against China. Except for playing around with elasticity of substitution, China's market is going to be 4 times the size of the United States. China is already the #1 trading partner for almost 200 countries, much more than the United States, and every one of the US actions seems to be pushing away countries. In fact, the more it exercises the participation constraint, the less allied countries are to the United States. So these 3 issues, I wonder how your framework deals with them. Thank you very much. This is an amazing, amazing project that you've won. Thank you.
Fantastic. I mean, those are great questions. So let me take them slowly in turn. Some of them I have better answers for, some of them I don't, and let me tell you which ones are which. So let me start with the first question, which I think of it in 2 ways. So a lot of people ask us, why now? What has changed? I think there's 3 things. The first one, it's more of a long-run phenomenon. Think of the world economy. The world economy has become dominated by sectors that are extremely internationally traded. Information technology, services, semiconductors. They're also sectors that have big strategic complementarities and economies of scale. So the economy has become much more prone to hegemons exerting power than they were many years ago. I mean, if we were all trading very localized good, this would be a small game. The fact that we are instead supplying technologies that have these characteristics activate the margins. Now that's a 30, 40-year statement. It doesn't tell you the high frequency of what has changed in the last 10 years. So let me turn to that. To me, there is really 2. The first is a pure change in commitment. I mean, look, the US has had a long-term tradition of commitment to institutions, commitment to multilateral agreements that very, very clearly has changed. So in this model, a simple change in commitment will do it. In fact, very much like the Carney speech, it tells you that in the short run, you probably have a ton of power. If people build dependencies on you, thinking that you were going to stick to commitment, the short-run deviation is very profitable because everybody's dependent on you. Now, eventually, they will adjust and fragment, and we're starting to see some of this. But in the short run, it's a big temptation. Now, the deeper question is, why the change in commitment? Is it just the current administration? Is it something deeper? Does it come with the domestic political economy of these issues? That, I think, is very interesting, and I have relatively little to say. The part where I have more to say and we're working on is the presence of a competitor. So I think of the following game. If I know that you're going to be in my sphere of influence for many, many periods to come, I slowly exert my power because I value having you in the relationship tomorrow and the day after. But suppose that I tell you now that 10 years from now, most of the value of this relationship is going to have to be shared with China. That might turn me very nasty and extractive in the short run. I'm going to squeeze you while I have you, because later I don't have you anymore. And so it's a typical example where commitment comes from the future profits of the relationship. And if a presence of a competitor erodes those future profits, that turns me into having very low commitment today, very extractive. So those are, potentially, hopefully, somewhat deeper. To your second question, we're doing optimal policy, not actual policy. Look, this is a model that tells you that even if you're a hegemon the size of the US, the value of your traditional allies is enormous. The US is a large economy, it's not that large. I mean, just finance to me is the typical example. Just think of a world in which the US tries to exert financial power and Western Europe, the UK, Australia don't go along with it. It's just very difficult to do anything. Part of the US having that nonlinear power comes from the fact that I've included that Belgium, Luxembourg, London, Singapore potentially will go with it. And so the last thing you want to do in this model is to gratuitously annoy your allies and make sure that they're not going to be there for you when you want to exert power the right way. That's a disastrous policy in this model. That doesn't mean that it's not one that doesn't get pursued. So that goes to what you were asking me on the second point. And now I forget your third point. Can you remind me?
Your participation constraint.
Yes, okay. So I think that the logic of the participation constraint is actually quite general. And we played a lot into things that move the inside option, things that move the outside option. Are you bargaining with a small firm, or are you bargaining with a government? What are the differences? That is one of the parts that I like the most about what we did. I mean, again, this is a generic tool of economic theory, but in this context, it really yields a lot of useful insights. Now, there's plenty that doesn't fit. Like all models, it's going to get more things wrong than it gets right, but I'm going to judge it mostly on what it gets right, and be happy that there's plenty that we didn't capture. The things to me that we're still deeply thinking about is, for example, theories of that U of Z, how much I dislike the other country. We have only shallow things to say about it. The best that we can say is that if you give it to me, I can show you how it affects optimal policy, and sometimes that's deep. But we clearly need a better theory for why they're there and whether they're invariant to policy actions. We don't have it. Paul Antras has some very interesting papers on this. Hopefully we'll get something better.
Yeah, thanks for a great talk. I wanted to amplify a bit on something that you acknowledged but glossed over quickly, which is the inadequacy of our empirical foundations to implement the formulas you described. So there's a very nice short paper in the current issue of the American Economic Association, P&P, by Laura Alfaro and others, that makes this, that kind of drives home the inadequacy of the input-output tables with respect to rare earths elements. And I think it just illustrates that, and I don't believe this is just a US-only phenomenon. I think the input-output matrices in most countries around the world are inadequate to actually implement the formulas that you laid out at a sufficiently granular characterization that they would give you precise policy prescriptions. And that's a measurement challenge, which we could have statistical agencies. And here there's really a need for statistical agencies to take on this task in the way that we think of the BLS and the Census Bureau in the United States and analogs in other countries measuring labor market outcomes. I don't think this is intrinsically any harder than what statistical agencies already do. But the other piece of that, which is intrinsically harder, is assessing the substitution elasticities. When you think about both demand side and supply side substitution responses, the difficulty and the time lag with which it takes to use innovation as a tool to circumvent or to modify these elasticities. There, I think there's, if you're successful and your chart, that chart you showed early on turns up, much of that turn up will be the empirical implementation at a granular level of the kinds of things you're talking about. In my own judgment, you tell me whether you agree with this, we are miles away from that point now.
I mean, I subscribe 100% to everything you just said. First, on the data shortage, as I mentioned, look, cross-border services we measure extremely badly, and services more and more are going to become a big part, particularly of the US, of geoeconomic exertion. Financial services, information technology services, cloud computing, all of that we barely measure. And then I made the case that the domestic data, it's just substantially worse than the cross-border data because of traditionally the incentives to collect it. And my sense is, in speaking to national security expert, that this isn't obvious to everybody, that collecting that domestic data is crucial. There is a lot more obvious recognition that collecting foreign data, it's obvious. Everybody wants to know what they're buying from China. And I showed a formula where that's important, but so is what you have domestically. And we're going to massively overstate the problem if we only look at the cross-border, because everything is going to look like we have huge dependencies. But for many countries, including the US, we import very little compared to our domestic ability to produce. And that's going to put a lot of stuff into a big, different perspective. I mean, think of a trivial example where you're importing something crucial. 90% of what you import is from China, but 80% of everything you use in that sector is domestically produced. I would say you're good to go. But we're going to claim that you have a huge dependency because we only looked at the foreign basket. So that, I think, and Laura, the paper you mentioned on rare earths, I think she's exactly right. Now, for rare earths, the domestic production of the US is small, but think of a world where we want to track the success to being able to do that domestic. Or think of semiconductors right now. I mean, domestic is a big component. So that I think it's 100% spot on. There are a lot of people that are doing excellent work in this area. Laura is one. Our colleague Steve Redding at Stanford is one. Ernest Liu and David Young are doing amazing work in this area. But the data limitations aren't small. I mean, we use the OECD tables, and they're very aggregate. So the other point that you made on the elasticities, absolutely. To me, right now, the value of doing this kind of theory is not so much that it's going to tell you, yes, this is the effect of the export ban for this exact type of semiconductors. No chance we know those parameters. It's actually the value is in the opposite. Is in making you and all the policymakers recognize that we truly have no idea and that the uncertainty on those parameters is very big. And if you want to make claims that these are successful policies are going to have huge effects, you're taking a very particular stand on the substitutability of this chip for another. For me personally, I have no idea whether the US export semiconductors are going to be successful or not. What I can say is that the case on what you have to believe is, for example, much weaker than the case for financial services. Financial services, I understand. It's a technology that is 200 years old. I totally understand why it's difficult to find an alternative and why it's difficult to build an alternative. The use case is also very simple. Think of semiconductors. I mean, 5 years ago, we didn't think that a cranked up autoregressive function was going to be changing the world. We don't know what this technology is going to look like 5 years from now. So it's just a much harder case to make compared to innovating, say, the payment system. Amazingly, in the US, across both administration, the biggest national security strategic sector, which is the basic financial sector, is getting zero attention. We're doing crypto, stable coins, all sorts of weird things, rather than improving custody payments. China is improving. China's put forward CIPS, which is a very good system. They're taking advantages. So to me, it's more about recognizing those limitations and making you think hard. We're easily 5 to 10 years away from having any decent answers. Please.
Hi, thank you. Very insightful. I'm an impressive for a lot for you to chew on. So as far as I understood, you take hegemonic power as static. How does a hegemon evolve? What is the interaction with military? What comes first? Is it military power or hegemonic power?
Yes.
And if it is military power, can your investment in military signal to other countries that a hegemon is being built up and so that lead to an arms race, and I don't know what the implications of those are. Any thoughts that you may have?
I don't know, and we haven't worked on it. There is a very deep question on how do hegemons emerge and what do they look like, which is somewhat similar to something that I've worked a lot on earlier in my career, which is how do you become a reserve currency issuer. In general, I would say that the answers are, from a theoretical perspective, not very satisfying. Not because it might not be true, but because the distance between the assumptions and the results in the models, including my own models, it's a little short. And so I've become increasingly hesitant to write them because I wasn't satisfied with the ones I wrote. Surely people will find better ways to do it. But there are a couple of things that are useful. One thing that I've been thinking about is the difference between the military and economics as an enforcement tool. The naive, or not the naive, but the immediate approach is to think of them as substitutes. I could threaten you with the economy or with the military. But if you think deeper about this, there might very well be complements. Because, for example, I might be able to threaten different sectors with these things, and power builds on each other. Or I might only be able to build a particular economic activity, which then generates dependency, if originally I could enforce it with the military. So I think the problem is a lot more complicated, and I don't mean military in the nuclear sense. On that, I'm somewhat with Dalip Singh, who was the Deputy National Security Advisor during the Biden administration. Said, look, I go to a table, everybody has got nukes, so that's out of the question, and what can we push each other around with? The economy. But more normal military warfare clearly has an aspect. The difference between purely soft power and purely hard power, it's one of degrees, it's not black and white. The reason why we focus so much on the economy is not that I thought the soft power was useless or their military power isn't interesting, is that that's where I thought that we could say something intelligent that was new and where the literature wasn't that developed. So it was purely marginal product of research rather than a grand claim on relative importance.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Yeah, please.
Since your early work was on reserve currency, to what extent reserve currency is an instrument of hegemonic?
I caused my own problem on that. I think there is a very deep connection. But it doesn't necessarily come from the thing that people obsessed about when we talk about reserve currencies, which is, do you get to borrow at low interest rates? There might be some of that, but I think it really has much more to do with the basic infrastructure. Do you control how we make payments, how we custody assets? That kind of stuff that used to be as boring as it gets. It's now the sexiest topic in geoeconomics. And it's a big deal. Now, I suspect that controlling that infrastructure does also come with being a reserve currency issuer. It's all part of controlling those basic functions of the financial system. But really, I think the basic stuff hasn't received enough attention academically or in the policy circles. I'll give you an example. Suppose that we make up a scenario and we say that China, 5 years from now, it's 10% of the cross-border payment systems, okay? Just make it up. Right now, it's somewhere around 3%. I would say that the typical policy discussion in the US will follow the following lines. No problem. Small deal, we're still going to be in the high 60s or 70%, as central as ever, nothing has happened. I would say that's an enormous policy mistake. From a macroeconomic perspective, I would very much agree. I don't think it's going to change how exchange rate, monetary policy transmission, all the usual stuff works. From a power perspective, that's an enormous change. Because again, power comes from dominating a sector. A 10% alternative is a disaster for the US. You lose most of your power from losing that first 10%, and disproportionately less and less as they grow bigger. Imagine doing sanctions on Russia if China was 10% of the world payment system. I mean, we can barely make them buy it, and China is at 3%. At 10% for an economy the size of Russia, that's plenty of market liquidity to conduct business in. So that's what these models are useful for. They just give you a very different sense of the policy conversation, and looking at shares and interpreting them as dominance is a serious mistake, and is one that I would say it's routine in the press and even in policy circles.
So I'm curious, how do you think about forces like inattention or preferences or more behavioral ways of treating institutions in the geoeconomic perspective? In a sense that what you show today is sort of pretty classic econ with, I don't know, elasticities of substitution, price theory, whatnot. I'm curious what are your thoughts on sort of more behavioral or more sort of there's just no legal framework around the stuff, so what fraction of those phenomenon sort of are central to the field? Thanks.
Thank you. And by the way, Alexi is a young researcher in this field who has an excellent paper on the military components and the dual goods, so I strongly suggest you all read it. I think it's an interesting question, and we haven't done much about. Now, there are things that I can forecast are going to be easy and things that are not going to be easy. What's going to be relatively easy is to put behavioral biases in the objective functions, because in some sense, give me an objective function, I'll give you what the optimal formulas look like. That game, the literature has played for a long time, and I can see that it's going to play in similar fashion here. The part that I find interesting is thinking about limited instruments. And some of the limitations might be behavioral. Here I gave, to make the theories work crisply, we gave almost complete instruments every time. But what if you can only do a few things because the rest is just too difficult? And what if, God forbid, these things look like tariff because you cannot do targeted redistribution or proper domestic subsidies? I think that that's interesting. It gets complicated quite quickly, but that isn't necessarily a bad thing. Where I find the behavioral approach would be even more useful is in thinking about repeated games and the dynamics and thinking about those commitment issues. We did very little. We kept it extremely rational.
So there's time for 2 more questions because we're almost done here. 2 more.
So, you mentioned soft power. I was curious in the context of soft power, you think of this as a political economy constraint
Yeah, I would do political economy constraints if it were me, much more in the geo-econ part. I think of soft power much more about some notion that your value function will align with mine if I convince you that this is the right way to do things. It's just almost creating like shared objectives. As you know, Paul has interesting work in that space. I don't, but if I were to use it, I would very much want to go down that line, but we just haven't.
Hi, Professor Maggiori. Thank you for the fascinating presentation on geoeconomics. I know that you are also an expert on international capital flows, and you are the director of the Global Capital Allocation Project. So my question is regarding the financial implications of your framework. How do you see geoeconomics shifting international capital flows, particularly portfolio flows and financial markets? And looking ahead, what do you see as the most pressing or important research questions in this field? Thank you.
You left that one as the last question. Okay, so a couple of things. The first is on both the financial side and on the trade side, fragmentation is happening, but it's like fraying at the edges. I don't think I want to give the impression that what we're seeing is a major unwind of globalization. Everything in the data looks quite the opposite. We're kind of leveling off at a whole-time high. What you are seeing is in particular sectors and in particular capital flows. There's a lot of FDI screening. If you're a US pension fund, endowment, large mutual fund, China is kind of off limits. not for entirely return reasons, but do you want to, how long do you think you're going to last if you're allocating 20% of your capital onshore in China before Congress calls and says, why are we sending American savings to China? I'm not making this as a case of it's good or bad, just as a statement that it will happen pretty quickly. So that's occurring. But the other thing that I would say is, I didn't get into it in this presentation, there is a naive sense out there that political rivalry means decoupling. In fact, in these models, that barely ever happens. There's plenty of reasons why if Steve and I don't get along with each other more than before, we might still have a lot of interactions between the GSB and Hoover. In fact, some things might go up. So that's one of the things that we're working on now. So the simple, naive, everything is going to fragment if we don't like each other, it's not actually a deep predictions of models. It's one that is just colloquial. And I think we need to get a much better understanding of where you're going to see these things happening if we want to trace them. So that's part of what we're working on now, but it's, you know, it's a huge question.
Okay, so Steve is going to be here until midnight tonight answering your questions right here. But in the meantime,
I'm glad you said Steve.
thank you for attending. Let's give Matteo a final round.